21st Amendment, passed by Congress February 20th, 1933, ratified December 5th, 1933. The 18th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed.
You can get alcohol again.
You can drink alcohol again. So, we talked when we covered the 18th Amendment about what brought the amendment about. And it's referred to a lot as the Noble Experiment. The idea of prohibition was, okay, we're gonna have no alcohol. It's gonna be good. It's gonna be so much better for the country because it's gonna prevent drunkenness and people failing to support their families and all of these things that were happening because of alcohol. And that's not really what happened.
Because people didn't stop.
For one thing, as I established, you can't prevent people from making alcohol. There is no system that is going to prevent people from making alcohol because it is a naturally occurring compound. People make alcohol by accident. You leave fruit juice around for too long, oh look, you have alcohol. People who wanted to make alcohol were certainly going to be able to do it. I said this in the last one. I say it all the time. There are a lot of vineyards in California. And while obviously grape juice is a thing, the grapes they produced were not well suited for just drinking the juice unfermented. So they couldn't suddenly start, even so, that's a lot of grape juice. And while the 18th Amendment did allow for religious use of wine, they could only produce so much, sacramental wine. Even with everybody and their brother claiming to be a rabbi. So what a lot of the vineyards started producing was these bricks of concentrated grape. And it would say, and I believe they were shelves. I mean, it didn't matter given the purposes, but I believe they were shelf-stable bricks of concentrated grape juice. And it would give very clear instructions on them of what not to do. Because obviously you didn't want this to turn into wine. Obviously this was so you could enjoy grape juice at home. So there would be very clear instructions printed on these saying, do not add X amount of water and put into a container of X size and put into a dark, cool place, because if you do that, it will turn into wine.
But also, besides the rabbis and the priests, another group of people decided to take advantage of shipping alcohol.
Yeah, there were the bootleggers. And the bootleggers were an even bigger problem. Like, what I'm talking about to start with is just the sheer logistical impossibility of preventing people from making alcohol at home if they want to. I would wager that something like 40% of Americans can make alcohol with stuff they have in their own house right now, and the rest of them could go to the grocery store and get the ingredients with no problem. The bigger problem was the people who didn't want to bother doing that, which I don't blame them. But there was still a market. And where there is a market, somebody is going to fill it. Also, you may have noticed that the United States has a very large amount of border. And one of our borders is the longest border in the world that is essentially undefended, the border with Canada. There are a lot of places in this country where you can walk across the border and nobody is actually going to notice that you're walking into Canada. And alcohol was still legal in Canada. And to a certain extent, there was the same issue with Mexico. Alcohol was still legal in Mexico. And there's an awful lot of coastline in this country. And there are all kinds of countries where alcohol was still legal that could put alcohol onto a boat. So a lot of people were able to ship alcohol in from other countries. People will talk about bathtub gin, and there was a certain amount of that. There are several things where, yeah, that was one of the sources. But also, there was just a lot of smuggling. And smuggling is a crime. And people who know how to commit crimes are criminals. And so the 18th Amendment was this enormous boom in crime because the people best suited to get around the 18th Amendment were the criminals. And they would become very, very jealous of their territories, and gang wars would break out. And while there were not, as we established last, when we covered the 18th Amendment, there were not a lot of prohibition agents. There were enough of them, and so there would be shootouts with the police, and theoretically, the police of any given jurisdiction would be opposed to these gangsters. However, a lot of elected officials and a lot of magistrates and a lot of police were on the take because the criminals could afford to bribe everybody
and
with
plus,
the money they were making.
And plus, a lot of the officials and police were wanted the alcohol too.
Exactly. Prohibition was a lot less popular once it really got going than it had been in the lead up to ratification. And honestly, I don't think they ever actually had the popularity in the general public for prohibition that they had in the halls of Congress. I think there were some very different thought processes going on. So, enormous percentages of the US population was suddenly okay with violating the law because it was a bad law. And where there are people okay with violating a bad law, there will be people okay with violating good laws to help them do it.
And so the birth of the speakeasy happened during these years.
The birth of the speakeasy happened. The real birth of the mob happened. There had been organized crime in the United States well before the 18th Amendment. But with the 18th Amendment, it just exploded because there was this desire to provide a service that the public wanted. And what they wanted was a place they could go and maybe get some entertainment and drink. And the mob provided. So the passing of the 18th Amendment, if anything, it seems to have increased drinking. And what it really increased was crime. To the point that there is a comedy about the mob set during Prohibition. It's a great movie. Some Like It Hot. With Marilyn Monroe, Jack Lemmon, and Tony Curtis is a great movie. But the inciting incident of the movie is the Valentine's Day Massacre. It's a fictionalized version, but Jack Lemmon's character and Tony Curtis's character are on their way to a gig. They're musicians. They're on their way to a gig, and they happen to be in the garage where the massacre takes place. And in order to get out of Chicago, they disguise themselves as women and join an all-girl band on its way to Florida. Fantastic movie. But it's a comedy about mob violence. And if you read books and watch movies made during Prohibition, nobody really stops drinking. Now, drinking itself was perfectly legal. It was not illegal if you had a wine cellar, or even if you had a collection of whiskey, to drink all you wanted of your own collection. You couldn't make it, you couldn't buy it, you couldn't transport it. But if you read the book of The Thin Man, the movie was made in 1934, and they drink a lot in the movie. The book came out during Prohibition, and they drink more in the book. And then it's made very explicit that they are going to speakeasies. The cocktail really came into its own during Prohibition as a way to disguise the flavor of bad alcohol. Because it's the stuff that was being made cheap, or the stuff that was being, the lower quality stuff that was being brought in. So you disguise it with fruit juice and bitters and whatever, and look, you have a cocktail instead of just a bad shot of gin.
Was this also the start of the federal agents?
Yeah, federal police officers really became a thing during Prohibition, because Prohibition was a federal law. Arguably, Prohibition's longest lasting influence was a rise in federal power. Because a lot of the states did not want Prohibition and did not appoint their own agents. Most Prohibition work was done on a federal level. It required federal enforcement, which means for the first time you have a need for a federal police force instead of just relying on things like extradition. So you get J. Edgar Hoover really coming to power during Prohibition. And the idea that the federal government has a say in people's day-to-day lives really starts with Prohibition. Most of the amendments we've covered have been kind of a groundwork level of this is what the society looks like. And what you do within that society is all on you, and we don't really worry about it. You don't, you can't be you can't hold slaves or be a slave. You have these rights, that's just the structure the country is built around. But with Prohibition, it's the federal government has the right to tell you you can't do something that you want to do, that is fairly common for people to do. And that is arguably the biggest increase in federal authority the country had ever seen. Yeah. Most people aren't really worried about interstate shipping laws. It's something that affects their life, but they don't think about it.
I find the reason why, even though not federal, it's state by state, each state right now is one by one getting marijuana legalized.
Yeah. And that is technically against a federal law, and we're going to see how that plays out in the next few years. But if the states had started randomly deciding to allow alcohol after the 18th Amendment and before the 21st, that would have been a huge thing. That would have been massive. Because it had been decided that the federal government had the authority to tell people they couldn't do that. And if the states tried to take that authority away, it would have been a huge fight. And they would have been smacked down in the Supreme Court, I'm quite sure. And yeah, the 18th Amendment was bad law, but it was law. And by being in the Constitution, it was the highest law of the land. There were federal laws before the 18th Amendment, but they didn't have the intimate reach.
Or the bite, not the bite.
Yeah. And there were a lot of people who dealt with federal law on a daily basis. If you owned a railroad, or if you were a manufacturer who sent goods from one state to another, or if you were involved in diplomacy, or, a lot of these people were dealing with federal laws. But the average person was not. The biggest thing they had to do with federal laws that they probably thought about was every 4 years when they voted for president. I don't think most people really fully think of their congressional representatives and their senator as being federal law, though it is. So most of the time, people lived in a federal system but didn't have to think about it. And with the 18th Amendment, they really started having to think about the place the federal government had in their lives. And even though the 21st Amendment repealed that, it didn't change the system.
What happens already in place, and it wasn't going anywhere.
Yeah, the federal structure had started to be built. And, 33, FDR was president in 33. So the federal system that he was building in part on the structure that had been put in place by the 18th Amendment. So with the 21st Amendment, alcohol was legal again, but some of the effects of prohibition lasted because the organized crime system wasn't going anywhere. Yet it reached its pinnacle under prohibition. But there are all kinds of things that people want that's illegal for them to have. And organized crime was going to provide them with that. Yeah. Organized crime historically speaking, has run a lot of gambling, for example. People like to gamble, and that's another one you can't really stop them from doing.
We mentioned drugs.
Drugs. Guns and drugs. That's the two big things that the organized crime system moves in this country these days. I am actually okay with a certain amount of prohibition of guns and drugs, because there are a lot of guns and drugs that I don't think the average person needs. And a lot of drugs you can't really make at home. I live in the wrong climate for coca trees, for example. I cannot grow cocaine in my backyard, even if I wanted to, which I don't. Marijuana, it's a lot easier, especially at a personal use level. And I've got a great story about my uncle trying to grow peyote in my grandmother's closet. My grandmother noticed that he had a plant in a closet in her house, and my grandmother thought to herself that any plant in a closet is not a plant that you want people to see, and if you don't want people to see it, there's a reason for that. So she looked up what kind of plant it was and discovered it was a peyote plant. And my grandmother knew that if she killed it outright, my uncle was just going to get another one, and she didn't know what it cost, but she figured it wasn't cheap. And so what she did instead was she fed it little tiny amounts of bleach. Not enough to kill it, but she fed it enough so that it never produced buds. So my uncle never got peyote out of his plant while it was in my grandmother's closet. And he never knew why.
Must have been a bad seed.
Yeah, my grandmother was a great woman. I loved my grandmother. But, I don't think that everyone needs some of the drugs that organized crime is currently selling. And it's not stuff that you can produce at home, so there's no point in trying to prohibit it. But that's what organized crime does now, and the reason they have the structure that they do to move the things that they are is prohibition. So there's a good and a bad in the long-term legacy of prohibition. The good, in my opinion, is the lasting... Oh, that's a fire truck coming up my street. The lasting federal system that provides a lot of good to a lot of people.
Of course, some people don't like that. Some people don't like that either.
Some people don't like that either, but I do. As a person on disability, I'm a big fan of federal systems. But I think we can pretty much all agree that organized crime is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't agree with that, you're probably in organized crime yourself. So, yeah. So let's move on to the next slide. The transportation or importation into any state, territory, or possession of the United States for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is hereby prohibited. And this allows a legal structure around alcohol. This is where, for example, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms gets some of its authority. We can set laws about transportation and importation. Manufacture is left out of this. Consumption is left out of this. Even selling is left out of this. That's still going to be controlled by your local and state laws. The requirements for setting up a bar, just because there's a vacant lot across the street from my son's junior high doesn't mean I can buy it and set up a bar there, for example. While we're allowing alcohol again, we're going to regulate it better. And the federal government gets to set regulations about transportation and importation because that's kind of the federal government's thing.
Now, before and after Prohibition, I'm guessing that there were only a few of the beer people before was still beer people afterwards.
A lot of the breweries pivoted during Prohibition. Some of them went towards making soda instead. Some of them fully shut down. It was harder for breweries to get into making things like medicinal alcohol. And when I say medicinal alcohol, okay, there is an extent to which, because doctors were still allowed to prescribe alcohol to people, there was a whole lot of whiskey being sold for quote-unquote medicinal purposes. If you could get your doctor to write you a prescription that you absolutely positively needed 3 shots of whiskey a day, you could have your whiskey because your doctor was allowed to write that prescription. There is also a legitimate need for alcohol in a lot of medicine. Rubbing alcohol is a thing. And when it comes to a lot of food preparation and a lot of plant substances just generally, there are some compounds that you can get out of a plant using just water soluble. There are a lot that are alcohol soluble. There's a reason for the Family Ties episode where Tom Hanks is drinking the vanilla extract, because vanilla extract is alcoholic. It is not strongly alcoholic, but vanillin requires alcohol to be extracted out of the vanilla bean. So your vanilla extract is, and it'll tell you on the label, it is alcoholic. So breweries are not really well set up towards medicinal alcohol, though a lot of the distilleries were capable of doing that. So they would pivot from whiskey to rubbing alcohol or whatever. And the federal government actually started poisoning some of these sources of medicinal alcohol to prevent people from drinking them, and people died. It was a huge thing. And they kept doing it with the theory that if people were drinking it, they deserved to die. So that's great. But yeah, some of the breweries just went out of business with Prohibition, and some of them started selling very, very, very low alcohol beer. Technically non-alcoholic is not non-alcoholic. It's a very low percentage. But some of the breweries started selling that. And there were a whole lot of ways to get around the fact that their business had been taken away that weren't legal. You know, it's not all what the vineyards were doing. An interesting statistic is that enormous numbers of saloons pivoted to being ice cream parlors with the coming of Prohibition. And it turned out to be so profitable that a bunch of them never went back.
It was like the birth of the Sunday during this time.
The Sunday had existed, but this is another one where it just exploded in popularity because it was better than nothing, and there were all of these places that were now selling ice cream. And so you get these, I think a lot of the bigger, weirder Sundays got their start during Prohibition. I'd have to do research on that, but I wouldn't be surprised. So,
I've never had an ice cream soda before, but apparently they were a thing.
Yeah, I've had one. They're okay. I'd rather have a malt. But there were a lot of ways these businesses were trying to stay afloat because a lot of the economy, I said this last time, a lot of the economy was built on these companies that made alcohol one way or another. We talked about the vineyards, but the hops farmers had to figure out what they were going to do because there is very little non-alcoholic need for hops. And a certain amount of the grain that was grown in this country went into alcohol. And were those farmers going to sell that grain for other purposes, or what were they going to do with their land? So a lot of people in the country were left trying to figure out what they were going to do, which was just what we needed in the years right before the Great Depression. Because a lot of Prohibition and a lot of the Great Depression are overlapping. And the two are not connected, but the economic problems of Prohibition did not help the Great Depression.
Yeah, of course. It's funny. I guess it's not funny, but ironic that what we call the Roaring '20s was during Prohibition.
Yeah, well, part of that was all the speakeasies. And it is true that the speakeasies help to break down certain barriers simply because if you were breaking the law anyway, it mattered a lot less who you were breaking the law with. So if you were sitting with a man in a bar before Prohibition, that was shocking. But if you were a woman sitting with a man in a bar before Prohibition, that was shocking. But during Prohibition, it's like, well, we're all breaking the law. Who even cares? And yes.
And was this also the start of I think, was this also the jazz music?
Well, jazz music existed before then. Jazz music is a combination of certain African sounds and certain Irish sounds, and even to a certain extent classical, that was synthesized in places like New Orleans, which are, big port cities where you get a lot of people from a lot of different places, and it's synthesizing all of these sounds together into one. And the origins of jazz go back to the 19th century, but jazz really hit it big during the 20s, and part of that was the performers in speakeasies. Especially because New Orleans was damned if they were going to let anyone close down their party. Not all of New Orleans is one big party. It is a real city where real people live, and there's a lot of stuff happening there. But when people in New Orleans party, they know how to party. And they weren't going to let that stop just because of one pesky federal law. There was a prohibition agent who liked to find out, he liked to time how long it took him before somebody offered him a drink from one city to the next. And the record was New Orleans, where in 30-something seconds he got into a cab and the cab driver offered him to go someplace to get a drink. So, New Orleans, the party never stopped. And that feel was very popular in speakeasies. The idea of this place where they just kept on going and no one cared. So the music of New Orleans spread. And there would become jazz sounds that were distinct to other places as time passed. But yeah, the spread of jazz is a combination of prohibition and easy access to recordings, be it records or the radio. So there were a lot of social changes that came because of prohibition, that many of them I think were inevitable. I think the country had just gotten too big to not have an effective federal system. And a lot of the social changes, I think, were inevitable, but they were sped up by prohibition.
Yeah, hanging out with women, hanging out with black people, it's just all new stuff.
And let's be clear, a lot of the speakeasies were still heavily segregated. Not all, but most, let's say.
Yeah, but you could perform there, but you couldn't eat there or drink there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You were at the very least getting something of a window into black culture if you were a white person going to some of these speakeasies. Because there were the performers. So instead of, you've got a string quartet and you're listening to waltzes, you've got a jazz band, and they're playing music you wouldn't have previously heard. A lot of the big names in black pop culture of the first half of the 20th century became huge because of performing in speakeasies. Louis Armstrong performed in a speakeasy or two. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, It was just where these people got their start. Because there were a lot of jobs. And there was a certain risk in taking any of these jobs because the musicians could be arrested too for being in a speakeasy. But at least you were getting paid to play your instrument. And there are not a lot of gigs for paid musicians. So something is better than nothing. Even with the risk of being arrested.
The risk versus rewards.
Right. And for a lot of the musicians, like, okay, you spend the night in jail or you pay a fine or whatever, and then you're back out on the street and you can get a gig at another speakeasy. Because shutting down one speakeasy didn't really change. Another one would just open in its place somewhere else. But again, a very lighthearted look at the whole system is Some Like It Hot, because the first 10 or 15 minutes of the movie is just, here's what Prohibition era Chicago looked like. And there's a Simpsons parody of the whole thing.
The Beer Baron.
The Beer Baron. And there is the oversimplified, if you want an actual historical take on it. But Prohibition has been repealed for nearly a century now, and it is still so ingrained in our culture. Anytime you see people dressing as flappers and things for Halloween, that goes back to Prohibition culture. The idea that women could wear these short little flapper dresses, that's Prohibition. That's, if I'm going to be breaking the law anyway, I might as well break the societal norms. The movie Chicago is Prohibition era. Velma Kelly works in speakeasies. Roxy Hart is drinking illegal alcohol while she's cheating on her husband. Like, so much of our culture stems from this sudden weird state we were thrust in, where because people were violating the law, they cared a lot less about conventional morality.
Yeah, you can see the change in bathing suits too, but before and after, like before, like all this whole bodysuit for bathing suits. Now then afterwards, it started getting less and less.
Yeah, until you get into the bikini, and to a certain extent, this happened again in the 60s, but it was never as vastly cultural shaping as it was with Prohibition, because quite a lot of the U.S. population in the 60s didn't smoke marijuana and never took LSD. But the percentage of people who drank alcohol before and after the 18th Amendment did not substantially change. So the culture underwent this enormous shift because everybody wanted to keep doing what they've been doing. And this is another one that's got a deadline, and it didn't matter because it was less than a year, but this article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by conventions in the several states as provided in the Constitution within 7 years from the date of the submission hereof to the states by the Congress. And, 6 or 8 months, and we're like, nope, okay, we're done. No more Prohibition.
And I think we mentioned this in talking about the fifth article. This was the only one that was passed by conventions, not by the state legislatives.
Yeah, because the states were just like, no, we're not doing this. We're done. Prohibition failed. We're done. We're out of here. That was the goal, and it's amusing to me that the first day when alcohol was legal in the United States is actually my birthday, because I still don't drink. But I have a lot of friends who are like, oh, did you know that Prohibition was... I was like, yeah, I know. I'm still not going to celebrate with a drink, because I don't. But people who shared my birthday and were born early enough so that they were of drinking age in 1933 probably had a heck of a birthday party.